Good evening, you are listening to The Truth Tank, and I am your host, The Tank. This is episode 27 of The Truth Tank, and we are going to be hopping back in the DeLorean and going back in time to ancient Judah to revisit our old friend, King Herod the Great. Where we just left Herod, he was well underway to completing the Second Temple complex. So we'll be having a look at the Royal Stoa, or Stoa, however you choose to pronounce it. I think it's pronounced Stoa. It's pretty much a basilica or a portico, a covered roof underneath a colonnade or a causeway. We'll also be having a look at the Antonia fort. A little later on, we're going to be having a look at one of Herod's smaller construction projects. Even though it's a little smaller than some of Herod's previous construction projects, it was no less impressive. And that project is the one and only Herodiu. So without further ado, let's get into tonight's show. This is episode 27. This is King Herod, part 5. So in the last couple of shows, we had a look at Hellenism in ancient Judah and the start of Herod's building projects. On the last episode, we had a pretty in-depth look at the Second Temple complex and all the trials and tribulations that went into building that. On tonight's show, we're going to be having a look at some of the surrounding structures of Jerusalem, some of which connect directly to the temple itself, and others that are located in the broader city. We're going to focus on two of the major buildings that are connected to Herod. Josephus even finds it important enough to write about these two buildings, so there is a historical significance that shouldn't be overlooked. So the buildings are the Antonia fort and the Royal Stoa, both of which were built as part of the expansion and renovation of the temple complex. So when we last left Herod, the temple complex was well underway. It took a total of 46 years, give or take, to finally complete it. Unfortunately, Herod never lived long enough to see its completion, which is a shame given the amount of work that he put into it. So for the purposes of storytelling, I've tried to keep all the building projects in the story of Herod in a linear, continual kind of format. Some of these buildings were started before the events with his family and Mariam. Some of them are after, some of them are going on at the same time. So a lot of the personal stories about Herod overshadow the building projects, and a lot of the building projects get muddled up with the details of his personal life. So telling the story of Herod in a chronological way can be very, very difficult. Now we're going to focus on his building projects, which took up a majority of his life and were his main ambition. That was his superpower, was monumental building construction. I'd even go as far to say that some of Herod's creations would easily rival any of today's modern buildings. That's not exactly that hard. Some of the buildings and architecture you see today are fucking horrific. It makes you wonder if the architects are blind or somehow mentally impaired to come up with some of the creations they do. So we focused on the physical construction side of the Second Temple on the last show. One thing I didn't really go too much into was the political and psychological side of the Second Temple, and there was a hell of a lot of that in its design, and also in its planning and its construction. The Second Temple was a calculated political move on Herod's part. There were many factors he was betting on just to get the project off the ground. Herod had a pretty uphill battle with most things he did during his reign, and nothing ever seems to be smooth sailing for Herod. There's always some trauma or some type of turbulent event that corresponds with him trying to do something. There is a good reason for that. He did kill a lot of people to get where he is. So the criticism is probably rightfully warranted. I'm under no illusions that he was a nice guy. He did a lot of bad shit to get where he was. But what ancient ruler, or modern ruler for that fact, hasn't? No one in that position of power has got there without getting their hands just a little dirty. I think you have to be pretty naive to believe that even today's political leaders or politicians haven't got a couple of dodgy things they would rather have kept under wraps, a couple of skeletons in the closet. And this is exactly the same for the ancient world. I mean, these people had no qualms about killing people in order to get what they want. You weren't going to go to jail for it. It was just how business was done. Or maybe that's just the ramblings of a jaded podcaster. And as we saw on the first couple of shows about Herod, Herod did face a lot of persecution from the elites and the high priesthood of Jerusalem due to his mixed origins and his perceived illegitimacy to rule over the Jewish land. Herod wasn't always that popular with people or Judah or the high priesthood. The rebuilding of the temple was a pretty smart political play by Herod, and it was one that ultimately garnered favour from the high priesthood. If he respectfully and grandly gave the priests and the people of Jerusalem a new temple, and he could show that he respected the old ways and traditions of the Jewish people, this might buy him some leeway with the elites and a little breathing room to get a few of his more outlandish projects up and running. These were his more Hellenistic-inspired projects. Herod had to tread carefully, however. He also had to show the high priesthood and the people that despite his contested legitimacy and his racial background, that he was just as Jewish as his subjects and the devouts. The fact that he had a lot of dealings with Rome and that it was the Romans that appointed him ruler of Judah made people a little suspicious and untrusting of Herod. And as we saw in the first episode, there was the siege of Jerusalem where he was exiled, and his war with Antiochus. A lot of Jews were killed in the process. Those that were loyal to Antiochus were slaughtered by Herod and the Romans and Herod's Jewish forces. So it's kind of a very weird civil war, kind of mixed up in a religious and political ideology. If you're interested in this, I encourage you to look into it. It's very long and in-depth, but it's a fascinating part of history. Despite these facts, there was the one giant elephant in the room that made people very untrustworthy of Herod, and that was the whole murdering thing. Rivals to the throne would always mysteriously turn up dead, so Herod had to please several separate but connected groups. The blessings of the high priesthood went a long way and could sway public opinion, which he desperately needed. The temple was the chess piece Herod needed to slide into position. Herod had to sacrifice a lot for the temple. This wasn't just a raving madman coming up with a grand idea and getting the elites and those that controlled the money and the power in Jerusalem to sign over checks to him. There was the planning, logistics and construction, but he also had to train priests as masons, keep up with the demands of the supply chain, and keep a temple open for business all at the same time. There's also a lot of very strict terms and conditions he had to agree to with the high priesthood. Only priests could work on the temple because they were the only ones that could see inside or go inside the building. That also included during the construction process. No one was allowed in to see the Holy of Holies, even though it was just a basic room that contained a candelabra. Only the high priesthood were permitted to do it. So there's that one huge problem is you've got to train a bunch of priests to do the construction work. You might have some of the best builders in the world available to you, but you can't really use them here. It also had to stay open and function as a working temple. And doing some further research on it, it sounds like they built the new temple over the top of the old one. They designed it to build a massive edifice over the top of the existing structure, and then somehow incorporated it and expanded the roof and made it look like one brand new building. But I'm not sure if that is how it was built. That's just another theory that's being put forth. Or maybe they kept where the Holy of Holies was kept, maybe they kept that intact and built around it and somehow blended that into the new architecture of the second temple. So after Herod had agreed to all the terms and conditions, and after all is said and done, Herod wasn't even allowed to enter the temple or its inner sanctum. After its completion 4 years later, he could not participate in priestly duties, ceremonies or rituals due to his mixed origins. So unlike Herod's predecessors, the Hasmonean dynasty, who served as kings and as high priests at the same time, Herod wasn't given the same title, nor was there any exception made. He didn't even get an opening day tour. He wasn't even allowed to go up to the temple, put his hand on it, or he wasn't even allowed to peek inside. None of the priests were allowed to open the doors. He couldn't just stick his head in and go, alright, this is what my money and time and effort brought. He couldn't even have a quick, well, this is where we kept this here and this room there. We keep this down the back, we keep this over there. Alright, now end of tour, time to fuck off. So that's a bit of a slap to the face for a man that has sacrificed and petitioned so hard to get a gigantic, world-class, tourist attraction essentially, designed and built in such a short time. And that was just the temple we're talking about. Obviously the whole complex wasn't finished for another 44 years. Obviously, more tourists are going to come, they're going to spend more money, it's good for everyone, but it's also respecting the old ways and the old belief systems. So Herod couldn't even enjoy, let alone see, one of the most magnificent projects. He had to imagine it like anyone else who was in the same boat as him. This is pretty brutal for all his sacrifices for the high priesthood, all the agreeing to the terms and accommodating of requests. He can't even peek inside the Holy of Holies or get an opening day tour or a one-day pass. So Herod's crowning achievement was a temple, and he could never truly experience its beauty or its grandeur due to the rules of the high priesthood. So what do you think? Do you think this is fair, or do you think this is unfair, based on his religious and heretical backgrounds? Or should an exception be made for Herod? And does that bring up the other question that if he's allowed to enter, then why can't everyone else get an opening day pass and have a look? Or is this religious control? Do these religious elites just want to keep everything for themselves? They don't want anyone to peek inside? Because that might bring up the bigger question, why are we following a belief like this? This is all horseshit. Could it have the potential to bring down the high priesthood and the religious beliefs of the time? Or have people, been so used to the indoctrination for centuries that they wouldn't even question it? I think that's probably more or less likely to happen. Every generation has grown up with the same belief system, and they just didn't have the knowledge that we do today to question things. Not saying that the religion itself is bullshit or anything. I'm saying religious organisations all around the world have way too much power. They play on fear and they get in people's heads. Organised religion is mind control. That's my opinion. You can disagree with it or you can agree with it. That's just how I see things. There's nothing wrong with being religious. That's a good thing. It's just when that is taken to the extreme, as we have seen in the past, bad shit happens. It also breeds the secrecy of religious organisations who can get away with anything because their power is untouched. Look at even today. The police have a hard time trying to prosecute any of these corrupt pedophile priests. It's hard enough just to get evidence on them. Whenever they do, it becomes a closed shop. The Vatican won't even out these people. And they've been covering this shit up for fucking centuries and no one's done a fucking thing about it. So it does make sense that the high priesthood back then wouldn't want a lot of their secrets getting out to the public. They wouldn't want people to be educated. They would like to keep their beliefs secret and keep people coming back to the temple day after day, spending money and worshipping, basically keeping themselves in power and their pockets full. Once again, this is just the ramblings of a jaded podcaster. But then again, look at the Catholic Church. It's the single-handedly the most wealthy organisation in the world, and it doesn't pay tax. Having said that, this also does show a great restraint and respect by Herod. Can we really call Herod the mad? He's obviously not a madman. He's a very calculating and savvy political ruler. He knows how to play the game and he knows how the game is played. He's showing restraint, he's showing respect. He could have just marched up to the gate with his Roman bodyguards and go, I'm going in, try and stop me. I demand you let me in, otherwise we're going to slaughter everybody here, or I'm going to, kick open the gates, have a look, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. The ramifications of that would have been another war, a war with the high priesthood, and you would have spent all this money and time building this giant, magnificent building for it to be pretty much destroyed by two warring sides. That also would have caused a lot of conflict with the people of Jerusalem. Herod wanted to rock the boat, but he didn't want to rock the boat too much. To get things he wanted done, he had to do and agree to a certain amount of terms, but he knew when to hold off, because you can't get your own way if everybody hates you. I don't think he ever would have tried to march up with troops to the gates of the inner sanctum or to the temple. I think he deeply respected the religion and the beliefs of the people. Like I always said, I think he was a man for the people. He just was willing to kill his own family to get where he was and to consolidate his throne. I don't think he saw the people as a threat, but at the same time I think he generally cared what they thought and was probably pretty fearful of what the ramifications of some of his actions might be with the people if he went against their religion and their beliefs. And obviously he couldn't rely on the Romans too much. This was his problem in his land and he needed to solve it. He couldn't just rely on the Romans, because then that solidifies the whole he's a Roman client, king, and a puppet of the emperor. It would also strengthen the argument that he was illegitimate to lead Jerusalem based on his origins. He's like, oh, look at this guy. Every time he gets into a tight spot, he uses Rome's military might to get what he wants. He has no respect for the people of Jerusalem or our ways and traditions, so he's just going to use the Roman military to bully his way into getting what he wants. But Herod never really does that. He always goes along to get along. In a way, his reward for all the sacrifice, labour and stress was more freedom to build his empire, unhindered. But Herod did leave his mark on the temple complex. He did sign his name with building blocks, as he always did. He also left a very strong statement in stone, and that was none other than the royal Stoa. So the royal Stoa was a grand statement of Herod's opulence, but also to his genius of design and construction. In order to accommodate the massive Stoa, this is going back a bit to the foundations of the project, the area needed to be expanded. Most importantly, the foundations nearest the edges of the Tyropian Valley. The environment and landscape needed to be manipulated to support such a large building. So firstly, the platform was squared off. A 35-metre foundation base was built above the slope of the valley. A 40-metre high base was also built on the Kidron Valley side. So there are 3 valleys that splice through the city. The valleys look like the remnants of a large river system from thousands of years ago. The Kidron runs along the outer wall of the city towards and near the Mount of Olives. The Tyropian, also known as the Valley of the Cheesemakers. So the Tyropian cuts through the city, splitting Jerusalem from the temple. Those 2 valleys kind of wedge off the temple and the city from each other. So in other words, kind of Jerusalem is more of a city of valleys, in kind of one way or another. It also explains the raised portion of the temple to the lower city. The third is the Hinnom or the Hinnomon Valley that runs towards the outer walls of Jerusalem. The area makes a branch-like shape around the city. Kind of looks like a tree that's kind of grown into the cracks of a wall. The Hinnom Valley is probably the most interesting. There's a lot of biblical mysteries that have gone on in there over the centuries. It's also the location of the said Silver Scrolls. And we'll probably be having a look at the Silver Scrolls in a future show. I believe they're the remnants of a biblical manuscript. Anyway, moving along. So the Royal Stoa was a sight to behold. It faced the southern end of the temple complex. In order to enter the Stoa, one would have to climb the equally impressive staircase. There were 2 access points to enter the temple. One via the Stoa, and the other one was through the Robinson's Arch, which we covered on the last episode. The ones we will be looking at now are the Holdar Gates. This is the name given to what remains of a double and triple gate that in Herod's day were the main entry points into the temple courtyard. So the Holdar Gates were unique, so in order to enter the temple, you'd enter via the gates, but you'd kind of go up and under the Stoa into an invisible staircase that came out into the temple complex. The gates and staircase were in themselves a pretty impressive piece of construction. The gates were originally part of Herod's expansion plans. I know it's just a staircase, but it's a pretty cool staircase. And just like everything else Herod built, it was grand and opulent, but also tasteful at the same time. He could build big and luxurious, but he did it in a very classy way. Unlike a lot of shit you see today with a lot of celebrity houses, they're very ostentatious, but they're a little over the top. They lack class and refinement. So the stairs passed underneath the Stoa and opened onto the plaza. The staircase opening was covered and blended into the floor. That also added and created a seamless entrance that flowed into the plaza, rather than just a staircase that kind of just abruptly bursts into the courtyard. It was more of a procession upwards. It created a graceful procession up the stairs and a slow gradual emergence into the courtyard of a holy place rather than just bursting through the doors. A modern day comparison would probably be like a modern day sports arena. You have like the staircases that are designed to get people in and out as quickly as possible. You have a large stampede of people cascading up and down stairs to get in and out of somewhere as quickly as possible, to get out of their seats to go buy concessions or whatever, and to leave as quickly as possible, where this created a slow, steady procession that didn't break the peace. So there's a large degree of psychology in the staircase. As I just alluded to, you ascend up into the temple and you proceed back down after worshipping. It also had a practical and functional purpose, like most of Herod's building projects. It was also designed to prevent crowds from forming around the central gate or exit. People would flow in and out gracefully rather than build up and then just start pushing each other and burst through the gates or the entry point like a pack of zombies. There's also a transformational aspect to the gates and the staircase. You go up a small set of stairs, you enter the holder gates, you're pretty much crossing through a portal, go up this procession underneath the Stoa, where you reach another staircase, where you then ascend to this heavenly holy spot above, this massive beautiful courtyard. As you get up to the last couple of stairs, you can just see the edge of the temple staring back at you, all gleaming with gold around the top of it. It would look very magnificent, and it probably also looked spiritual, or caused a sense of spirituality or a holy kind of sensation when you got up into the courtyard, which also added to the experience. You could also probably say that the sight of the building may have even invoked some type of psychological religious euphoria or ecstasy for some people. It might have also caused some type of religious delusion. Jerusalem syndrome today is a real thing. People go there and they get so wrapped up and enamored in the religious experience they can go temporarily insane and believe they're Jesus or some type of second coming of the Messiah. They can run through the streets pretending they're Jesus reincarnated and that they've been sent here on some type of holy quest to make the world a better place, to spread peace and love and acceptance among the people of Jerusalem and abroad. Jerusalem's probably not the only spot that does this. There's probably many spots all around the world to different religions and different people that can probably invoke a similar feeling. So in other words, you're starting on the earthly plane, the earthly realm. You enter the transformational gates, this transition point. You enter the portal, you pass through the procession, and you ascend to heaven pretty much. So is there a quantum mechanics side of this that Herod knew about that no one else did? Did the engineers and architects know anything about that back then? It might sound far-fetched, but the Buddhists knew a lot about quantum physics thousands of years ago. The Buddha was talking about exactly that in some of his teachings. Quantum physics and quantum mechanics aren't just a new phenomenon. The ancients knew about them, but they just talked about them in a different way. So you could go that route. You could go the whole scientific transformational approach. Are they trying to hint at a physical representation of a different dimension or a transcendental experience? Is this a physical way to try and get large masses of people to all think the same thing at the same time, or have invoked this spiritual or metaphysical experience? So when you look at it from a psychological and scientific standpoint, there is a large degree of psychology, scientific and transcendental undertones kind of going on with this gate. Yeah, it might just be a gate made out of stone, but it's what is behind that meaning. The entry is a triple gate and the exit is a double gate. Is that also telling us something? The Holy Trinity? From an engineering and design standpoint, the whole project was a nightmare and completely genius at the same time. Given the immense weight that the extended platform had to support, the staircase wasn't a simple incline with a few steps leading to an archway. They passed under the Stoa with all the weight bearing down on top of it. So it's a pretty big problem to have. You don't want the roof collapsing in on worshippers while they're trying to get up the stairs. Just try to imagine hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tons of weight all pressing down onto the foundations. It's a hell of a lot of weight to support. Just think of how much a temple would have weighed, and not to mention the Stoa, which was pretty much sitting on a semi-hollowed bottom with a staircase running through it. So the platform in general was in itself an engineering feat. This kind of really gives us a pretty good idea of how great the engineering was back then. They didn't have laser levels, computer programs, or any of the fancy stuff we have access to today. This is all done with what we would call pretty primitive technology. However, the ancients still managed to pull it off. So the platform in general was in itself an engineering feat. It had to be expanded, the walls had to be built up, leveled off, vaults needed to be installed, and then everything had to be filled in and smoothed off before the temple was built, which by itself weighed a lot. The staircase had to be built in a way that allowed it to be functional, passing under the Stoa, but also aesthetically pleasing. Good thing these were Herod's superpowers. This is what Herod really excelled at in his design and his architecture. It was functionality, grandeur, luxury, but it also was aesthetically pleasing without being over the top. So back to the design of the outside staircase, the one that you had to walk up to get to the Herodiu gates. The stairs didn't get overlooked or under-designed. They got the same treatment as the rest of the temple. So some reconstructions have a tower or a built-up kind of a mini-fort placed in between the two staircases. The most common theory is a platform flanked on both sides by the entry and exit stairs. And when I was talking about the design of these stairs, this is the real genius of it. The left side had a wider staircase than the right. People would exit the temple out of the double gates and descend down the large staircase or to the ramp that led to the markets that ran underneath the Robinson Arch. The staircase created an uncrowded, flowing descent back into the city. The right side, or the entry case, was smaller than the left and funneled people into the three arches. So this puts into perspective the intricate design of just the staircase and the archways. So you got to think of it on a daily basis. There would have been thousands upon thousands of people entering and exiting the temple. It shows you the level of detail and planning that went into it. So you have people walking up a smaller, more narrow staircase that led into the triple gate that divided people, so it kind of made the descent a bit slower. You pretty much had no choice but to slow down. You went from a narrow pass of stairs into a wide gate, so you had to funnel out. It also created a procession and slowed down the line. It slowed it to more of a flowing pace rather than a frantic trying to scrabble to get into the gate to get the best seats. Much like the exit gate, it also prevented overcrowding. So the overcrowding would have been a real problem. It wouldn't have looked good if you had just thousands of people just, amassing in front of the gates to try and get in. It would delay things. It would delay religious proceedings, festivals, if people had to wait to get in. So to get people in and out was probably a very big design consideration. And it's one that obviously paid off. It worked well. It served its purpose. Not a detail was overlooked, not even a stair. So the genius in the stair design was that they created a relaxed pace at which people would enter into the temple. Both stairs had adjoining ramps on either end of the platform that met in the middle and served as another entry and exit. The stairs leading to the triple gate were all different sizes. A smaller step would be followed by a larger one, maybe taking 2, maybe 3 steps to get to the next, which would be small to medium in size. From there you'd go to a larger 3 or 4 step stair. This was done to create a relaxed pace and procession into the gate. It pretty much forced the crowds and people to walk slow in reverence rather than charge up the stairs and cause a disturbance. So you had to walk slow or you'd probably trip over. You'd probably fall over the next step if you were going too fast. You'd have to really concentrate on your steps. You'd have to take 1 step, 2 step, 3 step. It forced people to slow down and be aware of where they were. It also would have created a pretty interesting spectacle. You would have had all these people walking very reverently and very rhythmically up the stairs to try and get into the temple. They would have had to have been forced to walk a certain way at a certain pace. Every aspect of the temple was thoroughly thought out. No stone was left unturned, no pun intended. Once through the triple gate, worshippers and shoppers would pass through Solomon's stables, which were the large vaults underneath the Stoa used mainly for storage. And once again, there's no piece of engineering that has been overlooked. The ceiling of the stables had massive arched roofs that took away a lot of the weight. It's similar to what Herod had used before in some of his buildings. It was a very simple and effective way to have a very heavy object or building on top of the foundations and have them take the weight and divide that weight equally throughout the arched roofs. So the stables were mainly used as storage for the market stall holders, and probably more likely the various things needed for the day-to-day running of the temple. There would have been a lot of upkeep. There probably would have been the occasional broom or dustpan lying around the place. You'd have to get dirty pretty quickly. Having all those people in there all the time, there would have been probably stuff spilt. The occasional snotty Kleenex falling out of someone's pocket. Dirty shoes. Someone probably walked through horse shit on the way up and not noticed. You have to imagine there probably would have been some type of janitorial cupboard or something, or a maintenance section somewhere in it. And keeping it under the stall was probably a pretty easy and effective way to do it. It kept it out of the public eye, but it was still easily accessible. So while I was doing the research, most sources say that this was a spot not to loiter. People would continue to walk through the stables and storage area and proceed up the stairs to the courtyard. There wasn't a place to hang around and talk about daily life or the sports results. You had to pass through, keep walking, and head up the stairs. There could have also been guards located there. I guess no one really knows. So the stables themselves would have been an impressive sight to see. The arches and columns held up the mammoth-sized roof, but also had their own artistic design. So even the area that most people would have just passed through and probably not paid much attention to didn't get overlooked in the design process. Every part of the new temple complex was methodically planned out and designed. Nothing was overlooked or taken for granted. I mean, that's something even with all the resources and computer programs modern day architects have, there's still a lot of stuff that gets overlooked. There's always a couple of details that slip through the cracks, but not with the temple. Well, there might have been, but no one has bothered to record it or talk about it. Obviously, it wasn't perfect. There was probably, a chipped tile somewhere or something that wasn't designed perfectly, but for the most part, they've taken a hell of a lot into consideration while designing it. So a nice touch and nod of the cap to the original creator, Solomon. He gets a significant portion of the temple named after him, Solomon's Stables. He also had the eastern portico named after him, Solomon's Porch, and the quarries that the stones were cut from are known as Solomon's Quarries. Solomon also had a series of connecting pools named after him that provided the city with water. No one really knows who built them or what year, but it's generally agreed upon they were built around the time of Solomon. However, that date has been contested a little bit. Herod may have built them and not Solomon. Most experts think that they are much more recent than first thought. They provide the temple, the city of Jerusalem, and Herodiu with water. Pretty much, they're just three gigantic pools that connect and overflow with help from gravity. Each pool is separated by a 6-meter repeating drop. So pretty much, in other words, the first pool fills up, water spills over the 6-meter drop into the next pool, and that fills up and falls over the next 6-meter drop into the pool, which then hits the channel that takes the water to where it needs to go. Putting it in perspective that way, that does kind of make sense that Herod might have been the one that built them. After all, did service three of his biggest projects, the temple, Jerusalem as a whole, and Herodium. So once a traveller reached the final stair, they would have been in awe of the massive temple standing before them. As I mentioned before, the gold that adorned the top of the temple would have reflected in its magnificence across the plaza. If the sight of the temple wasn't enough, and you weren't a Jewish male and couldn't enter into the court of Israel or the inner temple court or the court of the priests, you could just turn around and be blown away by the royal Stoa. The size and grandeur were a sight to behold, and were nearly as spectacular and intricate as the temple itself. The Stoa was basically a giant basilica which was open on one side. The whole complex was surrounded in porticos on all sides, pretty much porches or colonnades that surrounded the whole temple complex. The thing that separates and makes this one special is its size and its design. It's pretty much bigger and better than the rest of the porticos. So the Royal Stoa was located at the southern end and rose above the rest. The basic shape, if you haven't guessed, was a long rectangle with a roof and columns supporting the roof. Stoa is pretty much an interchangeable term for basilica or portico. They all kind of mean the same thing. It's known as the Royal Stoa, the Royal Portico, or the Basilica. So while it was open to the courtyard, the Stoa and the other porticos around the temple offered a good deal of protection from the sun and the rain. The Royal Basilica housed markets and stalls, and was more than likely the same spot where Jesus cleansed the temple. If we all remember that story from the Bible, this is where he has his pretty violent run-in with some of the market holders. It's also the same spot where he destroys the markets and chases out the shop owners. So one of the biggest factors that separate the Stoa from smaller structures from this and the later time periods are its massive dimensions. While its design may not have been that much different from the standard porticos of the day, the layout was much grander and meticulously detailed. Under the enormous roof that overlooked the courtyard were a base of giant Corinthian-style columns that supported the whole structure. The columns were similar to those that held up the curved roof of Solomon's stables, and probably appeared to the casual traveller like they passed through the ceiling of the stables and up through the Stoa. Josephus confirms the Corinthian style of architecture and the columns themselves. The Corinthian style of column was pretty popular throughout the Near East at the time, and it wasn't uncommon to the region. This goes back to Hellenism and it spread throughout Judah and the surrounding areas. Given that most of Herod's architects and engineers were probably Roman, it's not that surprising. It's the style of the day, it's the most common used, and everyone knows how to make it. Corinthian-style architecture has been found in various sites throughout the Near East and in excavations in the southern end of the wall, and there are remnants of it by later empires. I mean, there's a lot of cities of the ancient day that use the same Corinthian columns. Obviously, it's pretty prevalent in Greece, obviously where it originated from. Just look at the Acropolis, Delphi, places like that. It's also found in Baalbek, Syria, and in the surrounding regions. It's pretty much found wherever the Romans or Greeks went. In short, there are two types of Corinthian columns, or capitals or orders as they're also referred to, the Greek and the Roman. Both are very similar, with some little differences in the details, such as the leaves that adorn the top of the column. You can decorate the top with pretty much anything, really, and there are examples of them from all over the world through many different time periods. The style has never really gone out of fashion or really changed that much. It's still a pretty popular design element used today. You see it on churches around the place, public buildings like law courts and town halls. It's a style that appears pretty much all throughout ancient and modern times. There were 4 rows of columns that run the depth of the Stoa on the outside ends. There's also a symmetrical design element employed in the Stoa and throughout the temple complex. There was a very symmetrical 4x4 design element being employed. The columns weren't just functional, just pretty much holding up a roof. They also had to look good and add an artistic flair that Herod the Great incorporated into all of his buildings. The 4 outer support columns each had a row of 40 columns running lengthways at the Stoa, holding up the weight of the roof. There were 3 aisles making up the basilica, the 2 outer aisles being smaller than the central aisle. The outer aisles were 9.9 or 32 feet wide and a sturdy 9.9 or 32 feet high. The central aisle, on the other hand, was even more impressive. It came in at an estimated 33 metres or 108 feet high and 14.8 or 49 feet wide, pretty much double the height and width of the adjacent aisles. The columns themselves were a pretty impressive 1.5 metres in diameter, and it is said that it would take 3 men linking arms to wrap around each one of the columns. Pretty much 3 guys linking arms, hugging the column, would go right around the base of one of these pretty big columns. That's a pretty impressive feat. The columns were also placed far enough apart that they provided a generous walkway and enough room for the markets and stall holders who made their living selling things for everyday use and offerings for the temple. So Travellers could buy the souvenirs and all the offerings in one convenient location, compared to modern shopping centres. They even took into consideration the stall holders. They didn't just simply tell the stall holders, just make do with the space you've got, work around the columns. They actually thought of them in the design process. So you could probably compare the Stoa to a modern day shopping centre. And if that wasn't enough to get your shopping fix, you could just go around the corner from the southern wall, just underneath the Robinson's Arch. There was a large street that ran alongside the foundations of the temple complex that had the city's markets. There were stalls on each side of the street and along the wall. So it's important to note that the Stoa wasn't just a simple market with stalls selling and flogging shit to the masses of unsuspecting tourists. The Stoa had a more official capacity. Herod's Basilica, just like the Roman Stoas it was modelled after, served multiple purposes. It was used as a court of law, a banking centre, a meeting spot for Jerusalem's elite and lawmakers, as well as a centre for trade and local commerce. The Hellenistic styling was aesthetically pleasing, but it wasn't without some controversy. Many conservative and devout Jews didn't care for the Stoa or the business dealings that took place underneath its roof. To them it was a place of worship, a holy site to be revered and not exploited. Hellenism brought the style and structure, but many felt the site should be kept unchanged. And this kind of goes back to the resistance Herod faced when he first proposed the idea. A lot of people didn't want him to alter or tamper with the site, and those that thought a revamping of the temple was a good idea didn't think he could ever deliver on his promise. They thought it'd be another one of those projects that got started and never finished. And that was the biggest concern. The temple had to function as a functioning temple every day of the year. It couldn't just be impeded for 3 or 4 years or 40 years and not get finished. And that's also what led to some of the terms and conditions of the high priests. That being, the high priests had to be the ones responsible for constructing the temple in the first place. So Herod's grand vision of the temple was not shared by all. Many thought it should have remained much the same. The original temple was probably about half the size of Herod's temple. The temple itself was a pretty unique shape. It was more or less just a giant T-looking shape, or a lion sitting down with its head up, paws out and its body towards the back, kind of like the Sphinx is. It's a T mixed with a lion, more or less. It's a bit hard to explain. In the minds of a lot of conservatives and devout, it didn't need to be a fancy temple. It didn't need gold highlights going all around the top of it. It didn't need to be 30 stories high. It just needed to serve as a temple and nothing more. However, Solomon does kind of set the groundwork. He lays out the foundations and the design for the temple, which Herod pretty much copied but just made bigger and grander in every way. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, Herod's temple was built over the existing Solomon's temple. It was kind of like a Russian nesting doll. A bigger one was built over the top of a smaller one, or also much like the pyramid of Chichen Itza in Mexico. Going back to the Stoa, Herod is making a pretty obvious statement. The Stoa is his, and his alone. He wasn't allowed into the temple. He couldn't enjoy the inner courts or the temple up close, but he was definitely going to make his statement with the royal Stoa. So Herod definitely makes his statement. This could be a personal gripe against the high priesthood and the elites, or he may just be simply saying, fuck you, I'm going to have the last laugh. You can have your temple and all your secret dealings behind closed doors, but I'm going to make a grand statement with a massive commerce hub that overlooks a temple. So as I mentioned before, Herod's agreeing to the terms and conditions of the high priesthood, and in return he gets a lot more flexibility and freedom to build things his way. There doesn't seem to be a lot of backlash or protest from the high priesthood or those signing the checks, just the devouts and the conservatives. So despite all the controversy over the Stoa and the offence that people buying and selling things at a holy site, and the Stoa more or less being a commerce hub, it offered those same devouts a place to rid themselves of coins featuring images that weren't acceptable in prohibited and devout beliefs. So underneath the Stoa there were the money changers. Money changers could exchange a prohibited coin for a temple coin. They could also exchange many different currencies from all around the world. And in Jerusalem at the time, you had Jewish coins, Roman coins, Tyrian coins, Greek, Egyptian, Syrian, Parthian, Iranian, and probably Babylonian coins all floating around at the same time. So keeping tabs on one currency would have been a pretty hard job. So what is an offensive coin? So if you're a devout Jew, an offensive coin would have been any coin that had a depiction of a human or animal, an emperor, or people who thought oneself more important than the Almighty God. The coin system is a little confusing and in itself is a dramatic and interesting story. Certain coins were used for certain practices and could be exchanged for another form of coin or currency. So if you were participating in a religious ritual and you needed to buy an offering for said ritual, oddly enough, you could exchange the money from the Stoa. You could exchange a coin that wasn't accepted for ritual purposes at any of the money changers. You could swap an offensive or prohibited coin for one of the temple's own special coins that were accepted by the ritual vendors, or the ritual supply shop, however the system worked back then. There's this bizarre duality of the Stoa's commerce. People are selling shit that offends the devout and the conservative, but on the other hand, the average temple goer finds it a very convenient place and can pay with normal coins. On the other hand, it offers an easy and convenient spot for the devouts to buy the offerings for rituals, and if you don't have the right coinage, there's also a solution for that. So there's this weird, this is commercial crap commerce shit at a holy site. We should be selling stuff here. This is offensive, but it also sells the stuff needed for the rituals as determined and controlled by the high priests and the elites. These are the same people that have been dictating the terms and conditions from day one. So it makes you wonder, who said you need a certain item or you had to spend money to worship for a ritual anyway? So you have the devout elites and ritual overseers cashing in on the devouts who hate the casual worshippers, pretty much buying and selling popcorn and cokes at the Stoa. But both sides are as bad as one another, and are both essentially making money out of the worshippers and from a holy site. So who's worse? Both sides are spending money and both sides are making money. So the devouts are having to buy the necessary requirements to participate in rituals as outlined by the high priest and the elites. I mean, who says you have to buy stuff to worship anyway? These people do. So the devouts and the conservatives go along with this, but then they get angry that the average temple goer is buying stuff sold by vendors and sellers who obviously aren't devouts or conservatives. They probably are just business people and probably don't give two shits about the religious side of things. They just see the temple as a giant cash cow. And how is this any different from today? You go to a football game and you've got people selling overpriced food and drink, merchandise, and shit you don't need. Like, do you really need to buy a program for a normal round of football? Probably not, but in their mind, they've convinced themselves that they need a souvenir for the ritual of sport. In this case, they're immortalizing the sporting match they went to. Not quite the same thing, but it's in the similar ballpark. So one of the ritual items that was popular and purchased on a daily basis were doves. The dove sellers sold everyone's favourite feathery friends to be used during rituals and festivals. As most will know, doves are a peace symbol and are used by most religions as such. Makes you think there's probably a whole industry of dove catching going on. Do the guys that sell the doves obviously have some supply chain that goes back to a dove catcher or a dove breeder who is breeding or catching doves, selling them to the sellers who are selling them to the devouts as a part of the necessary items needed for the rituals? Do they have a catch and release program going? Do the worshippers let them go after their rituals or during their rituals? Are they caught by the dove catchers who then sell them back to the dove sellers who sell them back to the devouts to re-release them and continue the cycle? If that's the case, it's not a bad business model. It's a kind of a renewable source of income. I saw in a doco years ago, I saw a similar thing in a documentary years ago on Buddhist monks. There was a Buddhist ritual. They come to this spot every year. They make a pilgrimage there. And on the way to the site, both sides of the street are lined up with markets and vendors selling crap, basically to make money off of the Buddhists who are attending. One of the things a lot of people are selling are canaries and small birds. They have a cage packed with birds. They, wave these canaries about in front of the Buddhists. That's done to try and entice people to buy them. And it kind of works. On the documentary, a monk goes to one of the sellers and buys a few birds with the money he has. The seller sells them to the monk. The monk says a prayer, then releases them back into the wild. These birds will probably be caught and put in the same cage and sold in a couple of days' time. So it's a similar kind of thing. People have always profited off of religious festivals and people's beliefs. You see the same thing time and time again at festivals, concerts, any type of big public gatherings. There's going to be someone selling shit to someone who probably doesn't need it. In this case, it was the sellers were relying on the Buddhist sense of compassion and their respect for all living things to come over and buy the birds that they probably illegally caught. So the monks would buy them to release them. They don't want to see things caged. It's not the way things should be. And they are playing off of that belief and that emotion. When you think about it, it's morally wrong, but it doesn't stop people from doing it. People will make money any way they can. So it's a bit up in the air if the birds were sacrificed or not. Some suggest that they were eaten as part of a strict dietary requirement or killed as part of the abolishment of sins. Yeah, so maybe the doves didn't make it out of this one alive. Maybe they were being sold to be killed as part of the sacrifice in the ritual. I like to go with the first one. I like to think it was a catch and release, but it's probably more likely that they were sacrificed and eaten. So Donald T. Ariel, he's a numerologist who works for the Israel Antiquities Authority, has theorized that the Stoa might have had its own mint, which might explain why there were so many ritual coins readily available at the temple. This would make sense. It would make it a lot easier to control the supply and distribution of coins. You also wouldn't have to worry about running out. And if you did run out of coins, you wouldn't have to go far to find more. You wouldn't have to run around the corner or go down the street to try and exchange them and get the appropriate coins. If you were just banging them out 24/7, you'd be able to keep up with the supply and demand. It also eliminates counterfeiters and those profiting from the temple. It also keeps the revenue among the priesthood. It would have been very hard to counterfeit if it's made on location. Maybe you weren't allowed to come into the temple with a temple coin. You could only get them at the temple and they had to be used. They could have been like a little catch-22 to keep all the profit and all the control and supply and demand in one central location. So unsurprisingly, the mint was run by the priesthood. They pretty much control everything in the area, so why not the mint? There is some evidence to back this up. During the revolt against Rome, when Jerusalem was besieged again, special coins were produced called revolt coins. The coins found date from the revolt against Rome. It's just a theory, but once again, it makes sense. If the city was under attack and vital resources were scarce, you'd want to keep everything in one central location, and this temple complex is pretty much perfect to do that. If it was under attack and you needed to move people to a safer location, you could move all the merchants and personnel. You can move them towards the center of the city, which was pretty much near the temple. You could keep all your supply chains in the one area. It also would make sense if they moved these people into the temple in times of crisis. The temple itself was pretty much virtually a fortress. The Stoa was also located very close to where the silver reserves for the temple were kept. It's also another reason why the city and temple were such an attractive target. There was a lot of wealth, all located in a central area. The central aisle was double the weight and was in itself an entirely separate section. The view would have been good from the top. The balcony and terrace not only provided a nice view, but also doubled as a meeting spot for the who's who of Jerusalem and abroad. It also would have been a place to talk business and politics, do deals, and a place for domestic and foreign VIPs. It may have also contained market stalls or goods. So the upper levels, like everything else, were a lavish example of Herod's opulence and creativity. The upper deck was decorated with ornate wood carvings, the most luxurious materials available. To highlight this, the top level had a series of clerestory windows that provided natural light that shone through the windows on an angle, lighting up the whole lower market as well as the top. This is a style of window you see a lot in modern day churches, and it's a lighting effect that also might have helped to create a holy atmosphere. You have light coming in on angles through these wide, pretty much angular slits in the window. It would have created a holy or a spiritual atmosphere. It also would have looked pretty cool at the same time. So it's generally agreed upon by the experts that all in all the Stoa was an estimated total width of 33 meters, or 108 feet wide, and a colossal 240 meters or 790 feet long. That's pretty big. That is quite the statement to make. So what is Herod trying to say here? So I think he's more or less saying to the powers that be that I'm in control. I'm the bigger man, I'm the king, I'm the power broker. Or maybe he's simply just saying, fuck you to the establishment. Or is he saying, I built your temple, I can never enter it, but I can equal that with a massive Stoa that looks out on the temple, silently judging from the corner. It's a little bit of ego meets politics, and it also had to be worthy of Herod's grandeur. Josephus does say that the Stoa was 281 meters, 922 feet, and took up the whole of the southern wall. But it's all in the translation and the units of measurement that were in use back then. Josephus's measurements were all in the Greek stadion. Other sources use furlongs. It's the old way of measuring. It's pretty much 1/8 of a mile in the imperial unit measurements. So this is a quote from Josephus about the Stoa. This cloister had pillars that stood in 4 rows, one over against the other, all along. For the 4th row was interwoven into the wall, which also was built of stone. And the thickness of each pillar was such that 3 men might, with their arms extended, fathom it round, and join their hands again, while its length was 27 feet, with a double spiral at its base. And the number of all pillars in that court was 162. Their chapters were made with sculptures after the Corinthian order. These 4 rows of pillars included 3 intervals for walking in the middle of this cloister, 2 of which walks were made parallel to each other and were contrived after the same manner. The breadth of each of them was 30 feet, the length was 1 furlong, and the height 50 feet. Both the breadth of the middle part of the cloister was 1.5 of the other, and the height was double, for it was much higher than those of each side. But the roof were adorned with deep sculptures in wood, representing many sorts of figures. The middle was much higher than the rest, and the wall of the front was adorned with beams resting upon pillars that were interwoven into it, and that the front was all of polished stone. Flavius Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 15, verse 410 to 420. The modern-day estimates of the Stoa come from the prominent Israeli archaeologist Ehud Netzer. Netzer has excavated a number of sites built by Herod, and he also found Herodium in 2007. He's one of the prominent researchers on King Herod, and has probably conducted the most research on him. We'll come back to him a little later in the show. So the Stoa has never been excavated, unlike the other major Herodian sites. There have been a few things found at the Stoa, but due to the political climate, ownership rights, and the fact that there is a mosque built near the area now, it's a little sensitive. So no major excavations have been undertaken, and they probably never will. This is a quote from Netzer about the Stoa. It was likely Herod's most magnificent secular edifice. The historian Josephus praised the royal Stoa as more worthy of mention than any other structure under the sun, and described the building in detail. End of quote. I like that. It puts into perspective pretty much the magnificence of the Stoa, and given how close it was to the temple, That is saying a lot. It's in the same complex, and yet Josephus is making a just as big a deal, if not bigger deal, about the Stoa. Here's a few fun facts about the Stoa. During festivals and the Sabbath, priests would stand either on one of the Stoa levels or the designated spot on top of the temple or tower that faced southwest and blew a trumpet, announcing the beginning and end of the Sabbath, festivals, holy days, and other important occasions. So during the limited excavations to the southwest corner, a piece of stone was discovered with an inscription that read, "To the place of trumpeting." The stone was found facing the housing district of the city. This does prove that the southwest was the direction the announcement trumpet faced. And as I mentioned, the Stoa is more than likely the same spot that Jesus and the cleansing of the temple and his run-in with the dove sellers and money changers took place. It fits with what we know, and it also would be the obvious spot given it was a trade hub. This would also fit with Matthew's account in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21. Alright, time to move on. We're going to leave the Stoa. So, now we come to the Antonia fortress. The Antonia fortress, unsurprisingly, was named after Herod's lifelong friend Mark Antony. It's kind of obvious, that one. It's right there in the name. There is also some speculation as to when the fortress was built and by who. The Antonia was a large citadel located in the northeastern corner of the temple complex. The Antonia was built to protect the temple from whatever foe might threaten it. And with Jerusalem's past history of being attacked and the temple acting as a last refuge, it was probably a very good idea. It was also a sound investment to make. The citadel housed a quick reaction force, which was right next door to the temple. It also added a layer of safety and security. It also would have put the minds of worshippers at ease, having potentially soldiers and guards so close by. If anything did happen, they were only a couple of minutes away. Even though it was a holy site, there was still a functional design in mind, and that function was defense. You had to protect the worshippers, you had to protect the site. Chances are everyone who came to the temple wasn't always the best moral character. There's probably a couple of scumbags there. People probably would have tried to rob the vendors or the storehouses on more than one occasion. There's a lot of gold and silver, a lot of precious artifacts. So having a police force right next door was a good idea. The other reason it was a good idea to house a fort so close to the temple was obviously to stop any fights, riots, or arguments that would have undoubtedly have broken out in the courtyards. With any mixing of large groups, you're destined to have at least one fight every once in a while. Even if you only had a disturbance or a argument, a fight once a month, having security so close by was a very good idea. Even though it was a holy site, arguments probably still would have broken out. There were many different groups mixing. Some had different theological and philosophical perspectives. Devouts didn't like people selling things in a holy space. It wouldn't have been that hard for an argument to break out. All it would have taken was one person disagreeing with someone's religious viewpoint or belief system, or an argument over, whose God came first, or even as something as mundane or as simple as someone liking the current king, which that being Herod. One person could have argued, I like him, I think he's a good guy, he's doing good for Jerusalem. Someone else might have the opinion that he was a monster, he kills his family, he's a liar, he is only in it for himself, he's not a quote-unquote a real Jew, he doesn't deserve to lead. It's the same as the political arguments that happen today. Look at all the arguments that went on with Trump and Biden supporters. It's the same type of shit that happened thousands of years ago. The only difference is you have people in a compressed area rather than spread out. And even then, just look at the violence and riots that happened with the inauguration. So having the Romans stationed nearby was probably a very good idea. So, obviously one example of this would be Jesus destroying the markets. It's probably the most famous account. It also brings up the question is, why didn't the Romans stop him? There's no reports that the Romans ever tried to intervene, so maybe this reaction force wasn't as good as everyone had hoped, or maybe simply the Romans just didn't care. They were going to let the Jews sort themselves out and sort out Jewish business in the temple. But one of the most obvious and probably the most prevalent conflict stoppers the Antonia would have prevented would have been thievery and pickpocketing, and in later years following Herod's death, terrorism in the form of the Sicarii attacks against the elites on the temple grounds. This is something that happened, I think, a couple of years, maybe 5 to 10 years after his death. There was attacks from the Sicarii, who were a devout sect of something or other, and they didn't like the way the elites were doing things, and they were carrying out political assassinations right in the temple grounds, and the Roman soldiers had to be bolstered in the area. There was guards placed along the rooftops of the temple, as well as guards on the ground. There was also a pretty dramatic event that happened. The attacks got so bad, some rioting broke out between groups, and the Romans went in and massacred everybody. Apparently, I can't remember what year that was or when exactly that happened, but I read that in a history book somewhere. So the Antonia was appropriately named. Herod was sentimental when it came to his friends. Naming a fort after a seasoned warrior and friend was more than appropriate. Anthony had served Herod's father and Herod, so there was no more grander way of honouring him than naming a fort after him. It also helped the Romans that were stationed there keep a focused mind on protection rather than destruction. Rather than as a conquering army, they were benevolent guardians, protecting the worshippers of the temple rather than conquerors in a foreign land. So the Antonia was an imposing building that sent a clear signal to any would-be troublemakers. It was a large square-shaped fort with a large tower in every corner that provided a 360-degree viewpoint of the city, the temple, the suburbs, and surrounding landscape. It was also close enough that, if need be, Herod or the elites of the city could retreat there if need be. It wasn't really that far away from anything. It was kind of on the outside of the temple complex by itself, not really attached to the city, but it was still close enough that you could probably make it there pretty quick if trouble broke out or an army invaded or whatever happened. It probably would have served the elites better than Herod. After all, Herod's palace doubled as a fortress. He loved these dual-purpose buildings. The construction date of the Antonia is a bit of a mystery. The dating is subject to some controversy among the experts. Like a lot of buildings from the ancient day, there is some contention to the dating. Some say it was built 31 to 30 BCE. That would mean the Antonia was built before Anthony's death in 30 BC. So this makes it very hard to date, as it doesn't really line up with the construction timeline of the temple. So the temple was built well after Anthony's death. So once again, we had to turn to Josephus to clear up the details. According to Josephus, the fort had been built by John Hyrcanus, if you all remember him from part 1. The fort was later built or rebuilt by Herod. So maybe that is true. It would make sense if Herod stripped the entire complex back to its foundations and rebuilt everything. Any pre-existing fort would also have been torn down, redesigned and rebuilt. So obviously Herod does rebuild and renovate a lot of structures, but Herod's type of renovations is stripping everything completely back to the foundations and pretty much rebuilding it from the ground up. The other hotly debated thing about the Antonia fortress is the number of towers it had or didn't have. Josephus tells us that it was a Tower Antonia, but that description is a little vague. It definitely tells us that there was a tower, but as to how many remains a mystery. There may have only been one central tower, or there could have been many. He also tells us that it generally looked like a tower with 4 other towers in the corners. 3 of the towers were 50 cubits, while the tower in the southeast corner was 70 cubits. The southeast tower was the taller to allow a better view of the temple. Once again, that makes logical sense as a observation and defensive structure, but in the terms of symmetry, it doesn't really line up. But this is something we have seen in Herodian construction. There's usually a larger tower. He usually always goes for 4 towers, one of which is a bit bigger. One that is usually a little taller. It makes logical sense. It's a strategical design, I guess. It allows for greater visibility. So this is a quote from Josephus. For if a temple lay as a fortress over the city, Antonia dominated the temple and the occupants of the post, were the guards of all three. Archaeologists can't really make their minds up as to what the Antonia might have looked like, or how many towers it might have had. Some say it was just one large central tower, while others say it was four. Four towers comes from the modern reconstructions of the fort and the models of the complex that are in Jerusalem. A lot of experts think that the notion of four towers has come from the modern reconstructions and is designed to fit with that, rather than the reality that it may have actually just been one giant tower. I guess we'll never know. So the argument continues. From a design and a functionality standpoint, it's kind of either or really. One tower would be easy to build and cheaper, and if the tower was high enough, one guard could see for miles. The same could be said for a four-tower fort, just double the amount of guards. Four towers may also give you a better angle, especially if there are blind spots that a single tower just can't see, or one or two guys can't survey everything. Four would give you those unique angles. But from a design point, four towers looks grander and more intimidating than one. Money obviously wasn't an issue given the end result of the temple and the Stoa, so why skimp out on a defensive structure like the Antonia? So the Antonia is also said to have housed the vestments of the high priesthood and doubled as a vestry, pretty much a spot for the priests and diplomats to meet. And when you think about it, this is a pretty good idea. Antonia was a fort, so any valuable or precious item would have been pretty safe. The priestly vestments were very important. If they went missing, it would have disrupted the day-to-day rituals of the temple. These vestments the priests wore were also very similar to the ones worn while handling the Ark of the Covenant. And if you know history of Solomon's temple, that was the original home of the Ark of the Covenant before it went missing. But then again, maybe it was still there during Herod's time, and maybe that's why they were wearing the vestments, the gold chest plate with the jewels on it, their head guard, the groin guard. There's a theory that there was some type of radioactive material in the Ark of the Covenant, and that's why the priests had to wear so much gold to cover the vital organs. They had to basically wear like a lead vest made out of gold and jewels. Kind of similar to what Belloc wears at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, the headdress and the chest piece. So what if the Ark of the Covenant was still there in Herod's day, and maybe that's the reason he wasn't allowed in, because he would probably have wanted to open it or find out what it did. Maybe that's what the priests were protecting all along. Maybe it was a secret society of priests dedicated to protecting the Ark of the Covenant from prying eyes. Maybe the whole covenant being taken was just a giant cover-up, a ploy to throw people off the scent and just keep it where it was, hide it in plain sight. The story does go that the Ark of the Covenant disappeared during Solomon's day or during the Babylonian conquests. But then again, maybe that's what they want us to think. So maybe the vestments were kept there. It would have been a good spot to prevent theft. Also kept up the aura of mystery and secrecy, and the Romans would have been impartial to them and probably accepted the role as vestment guardians without looking too hard at them. I don't think they probably would have cared too much. They were pretty disciplined soldiers, and they probably wouldn't have stolen them or tried to sell them on the black market. From a logistical standpoint, having the Romans as bodyguards and custodians of the vestments was a smart one. No one would have thought about stealing them or assassinating the high priests in order to take them. The Antonia, unsurprisingly, housed a good portion of Jerusalem's Roman garrison. It's no surprise really, it's the perfect tactical location. It's also a strategic one. You could guard and defend the entire city from one central location. It was close to pretty much all aspects of the city. It was obviously adjacent to the temple. It was close to the markets, close to this old city of David, Herod's palace, the business center of Jerusalem. There may have been a lot of gates and walls to cross, but it was still pretty convenient. It would have been the perfect place to get Roman troops into the city and get them there pretty quick. And obviously the Romans are defending from internal and external threats. The Antonia obviously faced towards the temple in the city. You had viewpoints of both of those positions, but you also could surround You also could survey the surrounding lands, so you could observe anyone trying to sneak up on you and defend from an invading army if need be. The Antonia's location also meant it was easy access to key areas of the city and to the temple in emergency situations. And it was just such an emergency that the Antonia lived up to its reputation. It acted as the last line of defense for the Jews during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. After the destruction by the Romans, spot the irony in that one, flooring tiles and other remnants were used to build the new forums under Emperor Hadrian. Josephus steps in once again to provide some details that better shape our understanding of this period. He confirms that one of the two forums was built over the site of the Strathian pools. One final interesting fact about the Antonia was it may have been the site in which Jesus stood trial and was judged and sentenced by Pontius Pilate. This theory relies heavily on paving stones that were found under the Covenant of the Sisters of Zion in the Church of Condemnation, which sit on the spot where the fort used to be. The stones are thought to be similar to the ones described in John chapter 19, verse 13. In all likelihood, Herod's palace was probably more likely the spot for the trial, and once again Josephus steps in to attest to this. He says the Roman governors lived in Herod's palace while in the city and carried out the trial on the grounds outside of the palace. Makes sense. If they were staying in Herod's palace, it probably would have been bigger, more luxurious, and it's also a fort, so it's also safe. Why inconvenience yourself by going to the Antonia? There have also been some discoveries under the Tower of David indicating that Herod's palace was located in the western section of the city. And that brings us to the end of the show. We shall pick up the epic saga of King Herod the Great in a couple of weeks. We'll be having a look at some more civil projects that tie back into Jerusalem and the Second Temple. It would also be the final look at the Second Temple complex before we move on to one of Herod's more famous building projects, and that being none other than Herodium, the palace fort built on top of a man-made hill in the middle of a desert. That should be available in a couple of weeks' time, so look out for that one. And that brings us to the end of the show. A big thank you to everyone who listened. If you'd like to support the Truth Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. Subscribe to the Truth Tank on your preferred podcast provider. Follow and like the Facebook page to get all the latest updates about shows and what's happening with the Truth Tank. Spread the word, tell your friends, family, anyone who you think might like the show. People on the bus, strangers on the street. You never know, might be a good way to start a conversation. Every little bit helps. Big thank you to everyone who has downloaded and subscribed already. It means a lot. I appreciate every download. I'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with another thrilling, exciting installment of the epic saga of King Herod the Great. I know I've gone a little bit over the top with the amount of podcasts I've dedicated to King Herod, but I think it's a worthwhile story and one that needs to be told. I'm trying to tell it in a different way to how it has previously been told. His story gets very misconstrued by historians, and a lot of the accounts in the Bible factor into that character. He's a fascinating character and one that the truth really needs to be told about. I hope you're all enjoying the epic saga of King Herod the Great. The next episode will be out in a couple of weeks' time, so stay tuned for that. I've got a few more episodes about King Herod planned to round out the epic conclusion to King Herod the Great. I hope you're all enjoying it and not finding it too tedious. Hope you're all learning something you might not have known before, and getting some value out of it. I know I am, going over the history of King Herod. A lot of stuff I did know, but there's a hell of a lot I'm learning while researching it. So until then, I am a tank. This is the truth. May the truth be with you.